my loves, welcome back. I am going to be doing my January books for you today. We've got lots to get through. January reading is usually pretty good for me because there's not as much going on and I'm still in a reading groove from Christmas, and yeah, I just always end up reading quite a lot in January, and this month was no exception. Let me do the pile for you. So here is the physical books pile, but I feel like it's less impressive than the actual pile because I read a lot of books on my Kindle. I got a new Kindle for Christmas because my old one's battery life was completely shot. I also listened to a few books and I haven't got physical copies of those yet. I am the type of person that will buy the physical copy as well so I can have them on my shelves, but with the exception of one book which was awful, which I read on my Kindle, but I'm just waiting for them to come out in paperback, or just maybe when I have a bit more shelf space I'll buy them, but I've got a nice list of what I need to buy. Anyway, book club pick for next month. So February's book club pick, I always get confused by that. I have picked The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Lots of you guys said you wanted to read more classics and for me to include more classics in the book club as kind of like an excuse to read them, which I totally get. So I thought I would pick a Morrison because I imagine it's going to be great and it'll give you guys who haven't read it an excuse to read it. Plus it's one of her kind of slimmer books, so it should slot nicely into your reading life, hopefully. Yes, hopefully lots of you guys have read it already as well. That is next month's book club pick. I will just read the back for you. Toni Morrison's debut novel immerses us in the tragic, torn lives of a poor black family, Pauline, Charlie, Sam and Peccola, in post-depression 1940s Ohio. Unlovely and unloved, Peccola prays each night for blue eyes like those of her privileged white schoolfellows. At once intimate and expansive, unsparing in its truth-telling, The Bluest Eye shows how the past savagely defines the present. So I'm looking forward to this one. I've read a lot about it and criticism and stuff when I was at uni, so I am looking forward to it. Whew, let me just take a sip of tea. Let us make a start. So January's book club pick was Educated by Tara Westover. Judging by lots of you guys' reactions on Instagram and on here, you really loved this book, and in fact it just generally was a bestseller. Lots of people loved it in general. I sadly didn't get on with it as well as everyone else, I feel. Yeah, I feel like I'm part of the minority that thought this book was good, but it wasn't like amazing for me. So it's about a girl who grows up in a Mormon survivalist family. And basically that means that her dad won't let them be treated with modern medicines. They're not allowed to go to the hospital if they get into an accident, etc. And they also have no formal education and they don't go to school. And she didn't have a birth certificate until she was 9 or something. She grows up, and as she grows up she discovers that she really wants to be educated, and her brother becomes, one of her older brothers becomes more violent towards her, and she ends up going to Cambridge, going to Harvard, so she ends up getting a really high standard of education. So this is a memoir, and just as a disclaimer, it is hard to critique a memoir in a sensitive way, or you have to be sensitive about critiquing a memoir because obviously I would never want to invalidate anyone's feelings, anyone's recollections. You know, I wasn't there, I don't know what happened, and especially when it comes to trauma or abuse, memory and the idea of memory becomes particularly difficult. So yes, I want to be careful about that, and I just want to add that in, but also at the same time you don't want to let memoirs kind of get off scot-free, because I know that Westover definitely has a sense of her artistry in this memoir, and most good memoirs do have a sense of their own artistry and storytelling. I feel like you can still tackle them, but you have to be sensitive towards that, and this book has faced a bit more controversy than some other memoirs along that front, but we'll get to that in a minute. So I thought it was very readable. It had some kind of lyrical moments to it. I particularly loved any moment where she talks about the environment that she grew up in, because I'm just like a sucker for a big American landscape. I enjoyed that, and in general it was an interesting account, and Westover has done amazingly well to go from where she did to being at some of the best institutions internationally for education. However, so I know lots of people have issues with the veracity of her memoir, you know, whether it's very one-sided and the kind of logical issues with it. For example, obviously she said she had no formal education, and her mother kind of did like a bit part job of educating them. They didn't have access to lots of books or whatever, but quite a lot of her siblings went on to get higher education, to get master's degrees. So people have pointed out there's some flaws there. Her family has come back and said various things that they don't think are true about the memoir. I don't really want to get into, well, I've mentioned it now, but I don't really want to get into all of that too much, because like I said, memoir is a tricky thing. It's, you know, our memories are inherently flawed, and also they kind of by nature are a little bit fictional, because human lives are not perfect for stories. Like, storytelling is an art, and human lives don't necessarily fit perfectly within that. I don't love criticism that only talks about how this might be untrue or this might be untrue, because we don't know, we weren't there. And also Westover clearly had a hard childhood. Like I said before, trauma and everything like that can really complicate people's memories and people's retellings of things. So that so much didn't bother me. But what did bother me about the book, or not bother me so much, but I wish there'd been more of, was like, I wish there'd been more reflection. I think it's just the kind of literary part of me that just wanted her to kind of reflect on the idea of education a bit more, to be a bit more rigorous with her thinking. Most of the book is actually just quite literally just telling events as they were, centering on her education obviously, but also a lot about kind of various injuries that her and her family members sustained, which was very shocking and quite scary a lot of the time. But there wasn't a lot of theorization or anything about the idea of education, or what it really meant to her, or how education should or might have changed her family. I don't know. Do you guys know what I mean? Like, it just felt like it was missing something in that respect. But then that's just me as a reader, kind of what I prefer to read. So I think it will still appeal to lots of readers. And her story is certainly interesting and worth reading if that sounds like something you'd be interested in. But yes, I thought it was just missing something for me. Like, it's just a certain, especially because she is so highly educated, I just wanted her to reflect a bit more. And I don't know whether maybe that, she's still quite young. I think she was still in her 20s when she wrote this. I'm not sure actually when it came out, a year ago or a couple of years ago. 2018, yeah. So I almost feel like she should have just like waited a little bit longer and come back to the memoir at a later date. I don't know. That's just the feeling that I got from it. But yes, I hope you guys enjoyed it if you did read it, because I never want you to not enjoy book club picks, and let me know what you thought down below. Okay, now we're going to go in the order that I read them, as always. So we're going to start with the books that I remember the least about. So this is Lanny by Max Porter. This was absolutely top of my list when I was desperate to buy books last year, because everyone was raving about it, everyone was excited about it. It got long listed for the Man Booker, but didn't even get shortlisted, but everyone was saying that that was a travesty on Bookstagram, and that it should have been shortlisted. So I was very, very excited to read this. And we were in a bookshop in Bath, and I wasn't allowed to buy any books, obviously, sometime last year, and I kind of hinted to Zach that he should buy me this book. So I've actually got a signed copy, which is quite a fun signature there from Max Porter. But anyway, it's one of those books that's really hard to speak about, so I will do my absolute best, but I urge you to read it. It's really good. So but let's begin. So it's about a little boy called Lanny. He is growing up in an English village, relatively rural, and he is a little bit strange, a little bit artistic, and very charismatic for a little boy, as little boys in fiction often are. He is instantly lovable, but we don't hear his voice throughout the book. We're hearing from the point of view of his parents separately. So we get his mother and his father's perspective. We've got like a kind of, there's a local artist, and he kind of takes Lanny under his wing. So we hear from him, and we also hear from well, from the perspective of a character called Dead Papa Toothwort. So bear with me here, you guys. I know that sounds really pretentious and irritating. And it really has the potential to slide into that zone, but it actually manages to stay lovable, this book, which is good. So basically, DPT, as I'm going to call him, is a kind of spirit, an old spirit that's associated with this particular village. It's not like a general thing, it's this village. And he's like kind of like a trickster figure. And at the beginning of the book, he wakes up from this nap and he feeds off the voices that he hears from the village, and one of his favourite voices is, well, his favourite voice is Lanny's, and he really feels a connection to Lanny. And he, like I said, he's a trickster, so he's neither good nor bad. He's kind of like somewhere in between, and he kind of takes the measure of the village. He's been alive for a few hundred years, however long the village has been around, and he is representative kind of the village. Anyway, obviously quite a confusing character to try and explain. I don't want to tell you too much more of what happens in the book because it works well, kind of unfolding itself before your eyes, basically. But a little note on the style. It's quite experimental and poem-y at times, particularly with the DPT sections. So I will just show you guys that in those sections these are kind of the villagers' voices that he's listening to, and they kind of obviously squirm about the page basically, but there are lots of bits that are relatively standard, and also just quite readable still, so it's not so experimental that it's not understandable or not readable. I think pretty much everyone would be able to access this book and understand it, as long as you can get round Dead Papa Toothwort. So yeah, the writing is very beautiful. It's very kind of rich, but at the same time, like I say, relatively straightforward, so it's a nice kind of mixture. Things I particularly loved about this book: I loved the way Porter writes childhood. He just makes it so magical, and he really captures something about childhood which is really hard to capture, I think, and only the best writers can do it. So I was really impressed with the way he made childhood, and as a result, the book in general is very moving. It really touches you, and it's also covering a lot of stuff in a really kind of short space of time. Like, I think I read this book in an afternoon on the 1st of January, so you really get a lot going on here. There's stuff about climate change, about parenthood, about kind of what we owe to ourselves and what we owe to others, so kind of telling the truth to yourself, maybe the truth about your parenting, maybe the truth about your relationships. It's also about art, it's about stories, and also it's fundamentally about kind of that movement from childhood to adulthood and what is lost there. Yes, there's lots going on in here, and I would highly recommend it because, like I say, you can read this in an afternoon. Hopefully you'll really enjoy it, and definitely one of my favourite things that I've read this year so far. Next up, we've got The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This is another beloved book. I was really excited to read this one because last year when I couldn't buy any books, I was doing a lot of research into what I wanted to buy, and this series is the first in a series of books, which the third hasn't actually been published yet. It's widely loved in the fantasy world, so I was very excited to pick it up because I'm always looking for good new fantasy series to get into. So it's set in a place called Temerant, something like that, and it's about a guy called Quoth, I think is how you're supposed to say, or Quoth, or Quote, something like that, and he is, it's spelled Kvothe, but yeah, it says at some stage how you're supposed to pronounce it. Anyway, and he is in hiding at the beginning of the book. We don't really know why. He's kind of masquerading as an innkeeper, and then this guy called Chronicler comes to his inn, basically wants to write down his story about how he became a wizard. Did I tell you he's a wizard? He's a wizard, and he's kind of renowned throughout the land for doing various different deeds and things, getting himself into trouble, and Chronicler comes around and wants to write down his story. So most of the book is taken up with Quoth. I like calling him Quoth. In my head, that's what he's called. I know it's not the right pronunciation, but that's, in my brain, that's what he's called. And he tells his story, and the most of the book is told from his point of view. So what I liked about it, I liked the writing style. It's like old-fashioned fantasy. It's very evocative and atmospheric. The prologue is amazing. I absolutely loved the prologue, but here come the buts. But the framing narrative is so much better than Kvothe's own narrative, partially because I don't really like his voice and I don't really love him as a character either. So the fact that most of the book is his backstory told from his point of view is not ideal for me, because I love the framing bits, like they are much better written. It's weird. My main issue with the book is that it was so slow. I thought we were going to get to some of the juicy bits in this book, but we don't. We get kind of to the end of his schooling days, I think, which obviously is before major adulthood, and during his schooling days it's mostly about him being at school, trying to find the money to stay at school, etc, etc. So there's not a lot going on, and also he spends quite a lot of the novel debunking myths and rumours about him, and the reality of the stuff he's debunking is obviously a lot less exciting than the myths and the rumours themselves. So it kind of like is a bit disappointing, like, oh. And as a result, the climax of this particular book is not very climactic. And sadly, it is obviously, I think the whole next book is also backstory, like first person backstory, and maybe the third book is supposed to be getting to the present day again. So I'm not like jumping to start the next book, but I will read it because I'm quite happy to spend my time reading well-written fantasy. But there are, yeah, like I say, a few major flaws in it for me to make it, to kind of elevate it or make it particularly interesting. So I'm not, desperate to read the next book, but I will read it probably at some point. I am also a bit concerned, and I know other people are a bit concerned, that he isn't writing the last book, or the last book is not imminently coming. So I'm not like desperate to read the next book if I'm not going to even get to the present day anytime soon either. So yes, I'm sorry to those of you guys that love this. Please continue to love it. I just wanted more and I didn't get more. Next we have a slim little book of short stories. This is Pastoralia by George Saunders, who wrote Lincoln in the Bardo, which I thought I was going to hate and ended up loving and putting in my top 20-ish books of last year, which is up, by the way. Random moment, I have finally caught up with all my book reviews, and I did a top 20-ish books of 2019. So if you're interested, all those blog posts will be down below, along with this month's book blog post, because I have actually written it for once in my life. The reviews are written and ready to go live with this video, so that will also be down there if you ever need to refer back to reviews and don't want to trawl through the video. Okay, so these stories are kind of about modern America. They're about late capitalism, living under capitalism, about what that means, kind of the brutality of it, the humiliation of it, and also the kind of absurdity of it as well, which Saunders really plays up. He's well known to be kind of an ironic author, very witty, and he's playing up on these absurdities to highlight them and make us realise that we're kind of living in a dystopia, basically. So the good parts are that these are well-written stories. I was so excited about these. They're so loved as well. These are, I think, were written in 2000 or published in 2000, so they are relatively old now, which makes me feel old, but they are relatively old in terms of if you're talking about modern stuff, these sorts of things can get dated really quickly. The first story is by far the best, the title story, Pastoralia. It's about a guy who works in a theme park, which is a kind of nostalgic theme park, and he works there as a caveman. And even though there's no visitors in the park, he must act like a caveman at all times. He's not allowed to speak English to his co-worker. He has to eat, like, charred goat that he has to make himself over the fire. Although when there isn't goat, he has to survive off crackers. And at the end of the day, when the park closes, they're allowed to go in their separate rooms where he has like a fax machine and stuff like that. So it's kind of funny and at the same time really depressing, which I think is kind of the theme of these stories in general. And he's got a sick son as well, and he's kind of like semi-forced to rat out on his colleague, and all this stuff kind of happens to him, and you feel really bad for him basically, and just think, what kind of society would allow this? And it is ours. But the problem comes when, as the stories go on, I began to feel like the sort of like victims of capitalism become the butt of the joke, you know, their ugliness or their stupidity or something like that. And I just thought that Saunders kind of stopped poking fun at the society that would make these characters so much as the characters themselves. And that's sort of fine if you have a full class spectrum, but if you are purely doing that sort of thing to working class characters, then it really becomes a bit icky and really not nice at all. So I began to feel like it was just snobbery rather than trying to show up the system in which these people live. And obviously you do want to talk a little bit, I think, about the ways we participate in perpetrating capitalism or the absurdities or the brutality that goes along under it, but you have to do it in a careful way, I think. So didn't love that, and I also thought it was a little bit too bitter and too depressing. There was no hope, no lightness anywhere, and I think you have to kind of imagine that in literature, otherwise what is the point? So yeah, I was sadly disappointed by these because I wanted to love them, but I just couldn't love them in the end. Next we have A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin. This is 3 novellas about a couple of characters called Dunk and Egg. I think it's set 100 to 200, almost a century before A Game of Thrones, so 100 years before. I listened to this, which I wouldn't recommend doing, but only because I wouldn't recommend reading a book in general. So Dunk is a hedge knight, which is basically a knight that isn't pledged to any particular lord, kind of just wanders around being a knight. And Egg, I think I can say this because it's well known and you find out in the first story, so it's not a spoiler, but if you don't want to hear a spoiler, mute me for like 30 seconds. But Egg is essentially a Targaryen who Dunk mistakes for like a stable boy one day, and then they end up being great companions, and Egg wants to kind of follow Dunk around even though he is royalty. So the good about this is that it was better than the last George R.R. Martin book I read, which was the history of the Targaryens, which I talked about in my last book video. However, it was mostly bad, I'm afraid to say. They were just boring stories, boring in the extreme. Nothing about them to like make them special or interesting in any way. I'm sorry, I'm really going in on him at the minute, but I just think, like, why would you tell these stories? They're just not very interesting to me. I don't know. And they're all kind of similar as well. They were published over a quite a long period of time, and then he kind of published them together in this what am I saying, in this volume. They just weren't very good, you guys, so I just wouldn't recommend them. I'm sorry. Again, stick to the main event, and hopefully we might get The Winds of Winter at some point. Next we have a book I don't have, our first non-physical book, which is Shadowplay by Joseph O'Connor. This was another book I just could not get along with, sadly. It's a historical novel set in Victorian London. It follows 3 characters who actually lived, historical figures. There's Bram Stoker, who we all know as the author of Dracula. Then we have Henry Irving, who was a famous Shakespearean actor at the time, and Ellen Terry, who was also a famous actress at the time. And they were all kind of living and working together because Bram Stoker and Henry Irving ran the Lyceum Theatre together. Bram Stoker didn't have much success commercially or otherwise during his lifetime, so he did spend a lot of time being Henry Irving's kind of like assistant slash the manager of the Lyceum. So the good was the style was good, the writing of it was atmospheric, descriptive, old-fashioned, kind of creates Victorian London for you, which is exactly what you want for this kind of book. But everything else was so wrong. I just was massively confused by it. So I think, from what I remember, this book's framing device is that they are Bram Stoker's notes from memoir he was going to write for himself, but he sends these notes to Ellen Terry for her own memoir. And he says in the kind of prologue-y bit, obviously some of them are in note form, and he also refers to himself in the third person because he saw someone else do it and he thought it was interesting. So it's like, that in itself is a little bit confused, but yeah, lots of it's written literally in note form. It was like a half-baked idea of a novel, and then he's just like, oh, I can't be bothered to write the rest of this, so let me just pretend that they're notes. It was absolutely baffling. I honestly don't know where to begin with it. I think of myself as a relatively competent reader in kind of just trying to work out what things are doing in a book. But this one was just all over the place. Like, it would change, it would be like a memory within a memory, and then it would change topics completely within the same paragraph, it felt like sometimes, or same sentence. And I was like, where are we? What part of life are we in? And there was also no discernible plot. There was no, I mean, like, there is a plot. These three are work together, and then they don't, and they get old. But no plot beyond that. It was just like vignettes that were barely even vignettes. Oh my goodness, I've realised I sound really annoyed about this book, but I was just so confused by it. And it's got over like 4 stars on Goodreads, which is generally, I mean, these things are arbitrary really, aren't they? But generally the marker of a good book, or a book that lots of people were enjoying. But I really didn't get this one at all, because even if this is your type of book, I just couldn't understand how you would even make sense of it. There was a little bit of a supernatural element, obviously in a nod to Stoker's own work with Dracula, but never really gets to Dracula, and it really doesn't fit with the rest of the book at all. It's quite odd. This is one of the strangest books I've ever read, because I just clearly didn't get it at all, and I don't know who it was for either, and I didn't love it, as you can tell. So I wouldn't recommend Shadowplay, and that's all I'll say. I had to change my battery, so if I've moved slightly, I apologise. Next we have Stardust. Again, I don't have it. By Neil Gaiman. So this is the book that inspired the film. So if you've watched the film Stardust, you know what Stardust is about. But it's about a village called Wall in England, kind of like a small village. And there's a wall there, and on the other side of the wall is fairy. There's like a kind of doorway to fairy, basically. And this man called Tristram Thorne decides, in order to win the heart of the girl that he fancies, who does not fancy him, he will go, there's a fallen star that falls on the other side of the wall, and he will go and collect the fallen star and bring it to her. But turns out the fallen star is actually a woman in fairy. So yes, and everyone's kind of after her, various different groups, because she is valuable. So I listened to this book, which I would definitely recommend. Neil Gaiman reads it in the version that I listened to, and he's a great storyteller, and also it works well as an audiobook because it's a fairly short book, which I generally like shorter audiobooks. Otherwise I kind of get annoyed at the narrator, or the slow parts drag, or etc, etc. Gaiman's a great narrator, and it's relatively easy to follow as well, especially if you're familiar with the film. That can also be helpful when you listen to an audiobook, is to kind of like have an idea of the plot to begin with. Anyway, I loved the fact that it was kind of like an adult fairy tale with a kind of postmodern twist, because it's quite self-conscious, and it's got all the tropes of the traditional fairy tale, but with, yeah, just kind of adult and self-reflexive kind of twists to it. So in general, I just thoroughly enjoyed it, and I thought it was really, really good, and I didn't really have a bad word to say about it, but sadly, it's not great in terms of its approach to women or love. I mean, if you think about it, Yvain, who is the star, eventually, I don't think I'm ruining anything by saying this because it's kind of part of the fairy tale vibe, isn't it? But falls in love with Tristan. But the thing is that Tristan started out by capturing her, by dragging her along against her will while she's like severely injured. So although I totally got it and really enjoyed it, I was just like, oh, this isn't right. So that makes me a bad feminist, but I enjoyed it anyway. So also, people might not like this because it's a bit more understated than the film. There's a few elements that they definitely kind of over dramatized, which I think works well for the film, and I think the book works well as a book, but it's not maybe like as exciting as the film is. So that is Stardust, but I did like it. I think just Gaiman's prose is really nice, like it just reads nicely. So yeah, make of that what you will, you guys. Next we have David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, of course. Yeah, realised that the film was coming out soon of David Copperfield, so I thought I'd better get on and read it because I just bought it, didn't I, at the beginning of January, and then I found out about the film and I was like, oh, that's good timing. So I thought I would read it, and I absolutely loved it. Spoiler, I loved it. It's about David Copperfield. It's about his life. He starts off as in a relatively comfortable middle-class family, although his father has died before he's born, and then his mother remarries a kind of evil guy called Mr. Murdstone, and basically David's fortunes change. He ends up in like a workhouse as a child for a while. He meets a very large number of eccentric characters, and it's partially autobiographical, so that's why Dickens loved this novel himself so much. He said it was one of his favourites because, yeah, it's partially based on his own life. I was actually laughing out loud at this book, and it is like 170 years old, so that is saying something. And I'm also not kind of like a classics person myself. I used to love Dickens, and now I can remember why, because Dickens is just quite a readable classic author. I know that someone commented when I said this on my Instagram, someone commented saying, oh, I tried to read it and English is my second language and I didn't find it that easy to read. If English isn't your first language, don't feel bad when I say that this is readable, but I think to a lot of kind of native English speakers this would be a relatively accessible novel even now compared to the prose of other Victorian authors. I thought it was a good integration of social justice. Dickens always has like a social justice element to his books. In this one there was discussion of the treatment of sex workers, of marriage and women's kind of vulnerability within marriage, of obviously the plight of children working in Victorian times, amongst other things. But yeah, it's a perfect kind of integration of that. Sometimes the integration is less seamless, as in Hard Times, or rather Hard Times is a lot more serious than this book. This book is more fun and kind of like a good mixture of things, and a good mixture of melodrama, a good mixture of comedy, as I said, good kind of character study. There's lots of lovable characters in here, and also some really recognisable types as well that to this day really resonate. So in general, I just really thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I was so surprised by how much I enjoyed it because I haven't read a Victorian novel for a relatively long time. You guys can tell me, because I'm sure you'll remember better than I do, when the last time I read one was. I listened to Ivanhoe, which was a horrific experience. So I was kind of like, oh, will I enjoy this as much as I used to enjoy Dickens as a teenager? But I did. I really, really did. And it made me cry. I'm just such a big baby about this book. I haven't actually watched the film yet, so I'm really looking forward to doing that. And yes, the bad stuff, is it maybe a bit overly sentimental, and the plot all ties up quite nicely, and people coincidentally stumble upon each other just when they need each other. Like, yes, this is popular fiction, you know, it's popular at the time that it was written, but I just love it anyway. I'm totally there for a little bit of sentimentality sometimes, and Dickens truly has it all. There were a few slow bits in the kind of middle, but of course this was published in serial, so I imagine he was trying to eke out as many installments as possible for the purposes of a little bit of extra money. So I'm not mad at that, and I just really enjoyed it. Next, another book that I do not have a copy of. This is Imagine Girl, Woman, Other here by Bernadine Evaristo, and this obviously was one of the joint winners of the Man Booker Prize, and I personally believe the true winner of the Man Booker Prize because for last year, obviously, because I don't believe that the Testaments deserved it, even though I haven't read the Testaments. But anyway, this is a book I feel like everyone should read. It's about 12 people, mostly black British women, with the exception of one character who is non-binary, and they're navigating life mostly in the UK but also throughout the diaspora. So there's scenes set in the Caribbean and there's scenes set in America as well. So it has like a panoramic vision across all sorts of black British female or non-binary experience, and it explores those identities, what happens to each of the women, and how they live in each kind of separate iteration of the intersection between race, gender, class and sexuality, and even generational difference as well, how the intersection of those things differ with each woman and how they inform their experience. So yeah, it has a huge scope, as you may be able to tell, and each chapter is told from the point of view of one of the women. It's got a free indirect style, it's not first person, which I enjoyed because I thought it meant that Evaristo could allow you to see from the perspective of the women and really put yourself in their shoes, but at the same time have a kind of slightly wider view whereby if they are flawed, as some of them are, well, as all of them are in a kind of human way, but as some of them are more flawed than others, you can kind of, you have a bit of a distance, so you can judge them, not judge them, but understand them a little bit better maybe. So I thought that was like a clever way of doing it. And there's not a lot of full stops in each of the chapters, so the line breaks, the paragraph breaks do most of the work in the kind of changing of ideas, but there's plenty of those, so it doesn't feel too much like a full-on stream of consciousness or anything like that, but it's not, it's free and direct anyway. So yes, it really flows, has a feeling of flowing because of that as well, which I really like. So yeah, I really like this book. It was really readable, which is like my favourite word ever, but you guys know what I mean. Something can be readable and something can be not readable. And it was fairly straightforward in plot and ideas. It kind of put it all out there for you, but there were moments of lyricism where it becomes almost like prose poetry, like very beautiful moments. I was worried at the beginning that it would be a little bit disjointed in that we'd have like the different perspectives and that would be it. It would just kind of like this one and this one and this one and this one, and there wouldn't be anything really like moving to kind of push you through it, but it had a really cumulative effect. So the more I read, the more I really enjoyed it, and each of the characters managed to keep my attention in and of themselves as well. So Evaristo is an accomplished writer of the kind of short story as well, because I was interested in each of the women by themselves, and it had a really moving ending as well, which I loved. So it really had something that it was pushing towards, the kind of effect of building all these perspectives together. So I really enjoyed this book. I think it's well worth reading, and I think you should read it. So really enjoyed that, and I'm glad that it was so good, because obviously it's a bit scary when everyone loves a book and you're just like, well, I like it. But I did. Okay. Now we have Flight from Nevèrÿon by Samuel R. Delany, and this is another one of those ones which is a little bit tricky to get my words around because it is highly complex, but I will do my best. So this is the third book in a series which I've been reading extremely slowly. I think the whole series is called Return to Nevèrÿon, and I read the first one, I must have read in late 2018, early no, late 2017, early 2018, anyway, it doesn't matter. I read the first one a long time ago, and I've just been making my way through them very slowly since then, because they are a lot to take in. They were written over the late 70s and into the 80s. Delany is a famous African-American speculative fiction author, and he was also a significant member in the queer community. I've read his memoir, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which is about the gentrification of Times Square, and he writes from the perspective of a man who, during this kind of period when he was writing this, and also all the way up to the 1990s, he was cruising in Times Square, and obviously now these days it's a big tourist attraction and it's kind of lost its history in that respect. So all of that is quite important, particularly to this book, which I will get into. But these books are set in kind of a distant, barbaric past, in a kind of could be anywhere sort of place. They are sword and sorcery stories, so they're within a very particular kind of brand of fantasy. Each of the books has like novellas and a mixture of novellas and stories, but they all have kind of recurring characters in, or there's links between them, so they're somewhere kind of in the middle of that realm, that grey area. And I would say they are definitely theoretical fiction, so they're really, a lot of them are dealing with the theory that was big during the 70s and 80s. So they're dealing with post-structuralism, postmodernism, deconstruction, and queer theory as well. So yes, there's like Foucault quotes at the beginning of some of the chapters and stuff like that. The reason why I mentioned Times Square Red, Times Square Blue is because this particular book was written kind of at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, before Delany himself realised how serious it would eventually become. He wrote this book, so the novella at the end of the book, which is called The Tale of Plagues and Carnivals, is probably one of the first stories / novellas written about the AIDS crisis in America. And basically that final story mixes up, so whereas the other one's obviously fully set in Nevèrÿon, fully sword and sorcery, fantasy tales, that final story mixes up a little bit of Delany's own experience. He talks about like putting his daughter to bed, and it's got lots of little paragraphs and little excerpts basically. So there's some set in Evaristo, some is Delany's own experience, some is Delany's experience talking to a friend of his called Joe, who is a drug user and also a male prostitute. So obviously Joe comes into contact with the threat of AIDS and also people with AIDS all the time. So it's kind of talking about, yes, the beginning, and he kind of obviously uses Nevèrÿon and a plague that's set in Nevèrÿon that's kind of affecting queer people within Nevèrÿon to contrast and combine with the excerpts that are set in New York. If that sounds like a lot going on, that's because there is a lot going on, and there are lots of layers and there's lots of complexity in Delany's books. I don't know what the last one will be like, but anyway, there's a few postscripts basically at the end of this book which just go on to describe just how deadly the AIDS epidemic became, and they are completely heartbreaking obviously. And Delany says, when he wrote the story, he didn't know anyone who had died from it. By the time he writes these postscripts, he's lost lots of friends and acquaintances to it. So it is one of those books that if you're interested in that time period in the AIDS crisis, it is definitely worth reading, and it's an extremely important document and an extremely important book in general. So for that reason alone, and the fact that it is extremely well written, immensely clever, I thought this book was incredible. So yes, I also just love his combination of theory and fiction. I think it works so well, as an English literature student who enjoys that kind of philosophical debate and enjoys the kind of meaning wrapped up in the fiction. It's perfect for the likes of me. It is complex, and he uses theory like deconstruction and post-structuralism also, to really make the ground you walk on as a reader always slipping and sliding away from you. So just when you think you've got a set of signs kind of tied down and you think you know kind of what the symbols mean within the story, he'll like switch it up on you and completely just change your perception completely. What I love about the way he does it is that he always does it with political intent, because a lot of this kind of theory can be used to say, well, nothing means anything, it's all just words, and that really undermines the ability of any marginalised groups to say, well, this is really affecting our actual lives and our actual health. And he always manages to use that combination of fantasy and theory to show you how even those sorts of systems work to marginalise people. I don't know if that made any sense. You really have to read Delany to make that make any sense, but I would highly recommend his work. Yes, like I said, this is an important document, like a historical document as well, and I will be continuing to read Delany and working my way through his oeuvre, because yeah, I think he's one of those authors who is well worth reading. On to, I think this is my final physical book, but we've still got a fair few books to go. This is On the Road by Jack Kerouac. So on the flip side, this book is all style, no substance, which I think is kind of the point, but it's not a point I particularly love as a reader. So it's a book about a road trip between two guys, or mostly with two guys, and it's based on Kerouac's own travels with a particular friend of his. I can't remember what his name was. Obviously Kerouac is like a Beat Generation author. This is a classic novel of that era, but I have to say I just really hated it on lots of levels, and I'm sorry you guys if you enjoy this book, but I just really don't like it. So the characters are all kind of self-satisfied pseudo-intellectuals who are completely irresponsible. They go around the country leaving women in the lurch, pregnant often. They're misogynist, they're racist. It's just completely painful to read. And even apart from that, the plot is repetitive. There's no, this book is not about, you know, looking out the window at the beautiful landscape. This book is about the journey and the pushing forward and the going forward at all times and moving on. And like, there's a particular phrase he always uses, like rushing on or something. And it's just, it made my brain buzz. I was just like, oh my goodness, please get me to the end of this book. Just endless, like, on and on and on and on and on and on in the car, which car it is, how fast the car goes, etc. So for this person that likes a lot of American landscape, this didn't do it for me in that respect either. There's a few tiny bright spots in the writing where I was like, if you had not written this, typed this out in 3 weeks, Jack Kerouac, you might have been able to make something a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more beautiful. But yeah, generally pretty bad. I also thought at some moments it almost seemed like he was asking us to judge the characters a little bit, and I was like, oh, are we getting there? And then he just kind of took it back, and it just felt like a lot of romanticization of that sort of lifestyle, which just isn't for me. And I know I'm gonna get probably some hate for that, and I'm gonna have all the people coming at me in the comments, but I didn't like it. I really didn't like it. Okay, we've only got, I know we have got one more physical book. Where is it? There. But not yet. Next up, Imagine, Long Bright River by Liz Moore, which came out this year, I think. It's a crime novel, and it's a crime novel that I thought was a really good crime novel, just like really good at what it is. It's about two sisters, one is a cop, and they are estranged because of the other sister's addiction problems, and in general it's also kind of about the opioid crisis. It's set in Philadelphia, and I just thought that it was a crime novel that was responsible to its characters, without being like overly full of research or whatever. So integrated nicely within the novel, allowing enough of the kind of stuff you expect from a crime novel, the suspense, the atmosphere. So there was enough of that going on, and the information was integrated well, but like I said, it was just responsible to its characters and to its ideas and to its themes. So yeah, it was just well written. I enjoyed it. It was a page turner. It had a good ending. It gripped me, but it had a heart. It had a point. Do you know what I mean? And yes, in general, it's just excellent at exactly what it was, which is being a crime novel, but also discussing problems of addiction and like how that affects people's lives and how that affects relationships, and how the opioid crisis is affecting lots of lives, not just, you know, the characters in the book. So yes, I really enjoyed, probably isn't the best word for it, but I found it to be an interesting read, and I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for a good crime novel. Next we have Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. So I listened to this because I enjoyed listening to Stardust so much, and although Martin Jarvis, who is the narrator on my version, was really, really good, I would not recommend listening to this book because it is one of those books that has a lot of different storylines, different characters in different countries overlapping and going on at once, and I imagine there's only like paragraph breaks between them sometimes. And with audiobooks, I swear no one ever puts pauses in the correct places, so it just didn't work for me as an audiobook listener, because I always need something relatively easy to follow, maybe because I'm a bad listener, but also because I'm almost always doing something else physically when I am listening to an audiobook. So yes, I just found it a little bit difficult to follow, and I'd probably recommend reading it as opposed to listening to it. But anyway, what's it about? So you might have seen Good Omens, the TV show, hovering around. Maybe you've even watched it. I actually ended up watching it at the same time as I was listening to it, which was a little bit of Good Omens overkill. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I actually think, for once in my life, I actually think it almost works better as a TV show, because it's a little bit wacky. But I will just tell you what it's about now. So it's about an angel called Aziraphale and a demon called Crowley, and after Adam and Eve break out of the Garden of Eden, they live on Earth and kind of make lives for themselves there and end up unlikely friends, partially because you can't really categorize good and evil, or there's a lot more grey than there is black and white. And after a few thousand years, obviously, the end of times comes and the apocalypse is imminent, and Aziraphale and Crowley decide that they don't want that to happen, and they want to stay on Earth, and they don't want all the humans to die because they've kind of grown fond of us, and they conspire together to put a stop to it, basically, against their superiors. And it's obviously by two enormous figures in the fantasy / speculative fiction world, in Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, and I almost think that this might be the problem with this book. It was written, or it was published in 1990, so yes, that is definitely getting on now. It feels a little dated at times, but anyway, I do wonder, yeah, if maybe that's why it suffered in a few ways that it did. So it's not a comic book, it's a comedy book, and it's enjoyable enough, and it is, you know, at times very funny, and you know, there's enough charisma in the writing to keep you interested and to keep you reading. However, I thought there was a lot of odd plot choices. It's a lot of exposition leading up to not much in terms of climax, and I just thought, considering the kind of drama of the topic they picked, it just seemed odd to me the way they chose to go about it, and yeah, like I said, not actually that climactic in the end, and I just was like, why choose this particular story if you're not gonna kind of do loads more with it, if you know what I mean. Like I said before, it's a bit dated now. There's a lot of stuff that would not fly today and is offensive, although there is some kind of political analysis in there that still is sadly quite relevant as well. It was a little bit too on the nose sometimes, and it's not as funny as it thinks it is. Like, the jokes just aren't as hilarious. Yeah, it's just a little bit too much, too in your face sometimes with the jokes. But in general, it was enjoyable, and I would recommend the TV show if you want to watch something completely wacky and also watch David Tennant be completely weird. On to In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. Again, don't have this one. I love that I'm just holding these imaginary books up, which I read on my Kindle, hence why I don't have it. And it's about Machado's relationship with a abusive woman. So it's kind of more widely about same-sex abuse and abuse in queer relationships. She's pushing that into the mainstream, which I completely admire her for, and it's good that it's being widely read and widely loved as well. The style is quite experimental. The chapters, it uses this idea of the dream house where a lot of the abuse took place as a kind of architecture for thought, and then each of the chapters comes under kind of like a genre heading. So it's like dream house as romance story, or dream house as fantasy, or dream house as this, that and the other. There's even like a choose your own adventure section. And some of the chapters are obviously about kind of like vignettes about Machado's relationship, and others are talking queer theory or Machado's own theory about certain popular culture things, films, TV shows, etc. I thought it was an important novel, and like I said, good that lots of people are reading it, and good to be putting those ideas out into the world. I'm sure that it has been really helpful for a lot of people coming to terms with their own abuse, and I really admire Machado for that. But I didn't love it as much as everyone. Obviously, like I said, when it came to Tara Westover's book, it is really tricky to approach a memoir in a sensitive and informed way. I'm just not sure I love her style of writing. I think it's just a little bit too overwritten at times and self-conscious for me as a reader. It doesn't feel like, it doesn't exude confidence. You know, when you are going to be an experimental writer, or a writer that uses a lot of kind of rich and evocative language, I feel like you have to exude a confidence about it, and I don't feel like I got that from Machado's work. But this is, I think, her second book. I really could be wrong, and the first one was a book of short stories. So it might be that she becomes that, or she gets that confidence, for me anyway, in the way I read her books in later books, if you know what I mean. I didn't feel like she did quite enough with the genre thing. So it's a very experimental way of writing a memoir anyway. I'm sorry, my loves, I've just had to change my battery again. But anyway, it's an experimental form for a memoir anyway, which I admire her for, and I think it's great to experiment with other forms that aren't fiction. Like, not a lot of people experiment with memoir, but I feel like if you're going to do the genre thing, you really got to like push it a little bit further. Like, I feel like her voice was the same throughout, and I didn't really notice a huge, apart from maybe the content, but I didn't notice a huge difference stylistically between the different genres. So obviously, I don't know, maybe it's all in the title, but I just felt like she could have just done a little bit more with that. And I also didn't always love her cultural commentary. I thought sometimes it was a little bit unnuanced for me. But in general, I think it's a book worth reading, and I will be reading her stories just to see how I get on with those. But yeah, I sense that her style might just not be my favourite kind of style, but we shall see. Okay, final book, you guys, and we've landed on a physical book. This is There by Tommy Orange, who is a new contemporary Native American author. This is his debut novel, and it's about a group of people going to a powwow, the Oakland powwow. Some of them are going to reconnect with their heritage or to learn about their heritage. Some are going to reconnect or discover family members. Some of them are just doing their job, they just run the powwow. Some of them are going to perform, either for money or for just the sheer joy of performing, and crucially there's also a set of characters that are going to rob the powwow because they found out that there's going to be cash on site, basically. So it's about kind of the coming together of these people, these Native American characters, and a little bit about each of their backstories and that sort of thing as well. And each chapter is told from their point of view, either it's first person or third person. It's kind of a mixture. So I thought this book had loads of potential. The opening was incredible. It kind of opens with a sort of, is it a yeah, it's a prologue. I thought the prologue was like amazing. Marlon James says on the front of this book it's a thunderclap, and that's exactly what the prologue felt like to me. It was really just a real punch basically, and it sort of sets up a little bit of crucial Native American history for anyone that isn't familiar with it, and a little bit about the life of the urban Indian, and kind of trying to write them back into the narrative. I loved the beginning, and I thought I wrote down probably the most direct quotes from this book, because I don't often write down direct quotes in my notes because it takes ages, but I probably wrote down the most from this book just because I thought the writing was so succinctly heartbreaking and affecting, and yeah, I wrote down lots of quotes from it. I really enjoyed the writing style, but sadly I just thought it didn't really fulfill in the rest of the novel, or kind of plot wise. I was definitely confused by the end because it just felt a bit rushed. Some of the characters were a bit half-baked or even quite similar to one another, and I didn't understand why there were so many when he could have kind of like narrowed them down a little bit. At the same time, it was too short, like it kind of needed a bit more, just like a bit more meat to it, and it just didn't quite go all the way there for me. But it is a first novel, and I will definitely be reading anything that Tommy Orange writes in the future, and I also still think it is worth reading because lots of people enjoy this book. Obviously I'm highly critical of all books that I read, probably unfairly a lot of the time, and I still think lots of people would enjoy this book, and I also think it's an important book, and a new Native American voice is always worth reading, so I would highly recommend you read it, even though I didn't think it was a perfect book. So you guys, that is me finished, 2 battery changes later. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you again very soon for February book video. I'm going away this month, so hopefully I'll get lots of reading done whilst I'm in St Lucia. And I hope you enjoyed The Bluest Eye if you haven't read it yet and you're going to read it this month with me. Check out down below if you want any more book content, because there will be lots of book blog posts going on in the description box. That's it for now, you guys. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.